We're going to begin in any case, and I'm going to ask the staff to close the door so we don't hear. Hello? Would you ask them to close the door so we don't hear? I do want to emphasize that though I have a statehood forum every Congressional Black Caucus month when we have our CBC events, this one is different from any I've ever held, and I'm going to ask all of you to get ready to participate even as the panel is doing. Because what we're doing here today is drawing what I would call near-term advice and counsel on what to do as all the polls show Democrats are going to take back the House. And if they do, the possibility of going to the House floor to ask for a vote is once again there. So this is a very different statehood forum today. Just going to the House floor is not a given, I should say. Usually they don't allow you to go to the House floor with a bill unless they know the bill is going to pass. So that is not a sure thing, although I must say, as I will indicate in a few minutes, that I did get a vote on the House floor when I wasn't sure it would pass once before. There's going to be plenty of time for the audience to be involved in the response to what we need to hear and to offer advice and counsel on what we ought to do beyond asking any questions that you may have. Now, I don't want to suffer any illusions here that statehood is just around the corner. This is an uphill climb. Some of you may remember when we virtually got the vote in the House and how we did it when Utah and D.C. went together. If you want to hear more about how we did that, but that is how we got to the point where the House and the Senate voted to give D.C. a vote in the House, which would have been a big step forward towards statehood. The reason we don't have that vote in the House now is because the NRA, National Rifle Association, in case those initials are not familiar to you, attached a rider that would have wiped out all of the DC's gun laws, and so we had to, wishingly, leave that vote on the table. But we are getting somewhere. Almost all the House Democrats are either original co-sponsors or indeed co-sponsors of the statehood bill. Original co-sponsors is somebody who sponsors the bill when I introduce it, the same way I do. And there were hundreds of those. And then there are co-sponsors, people who come on to the bill. So most House Democrats are already there. More than half of the Senate Democrats are co-sponsors of our D.C. statehood bill. So we're looking for practical steps, practical advice going forward in case there is a change as we think will happen in the House. And if you look at the polls and hear the pundits who are saying that we're getting closer and closer to a change in the Senate as well. The Senate is a horse of a different color, of course, but it does tell you something about the kind of climate we have now. And the question for the House is, how do we take advantage of it? With a lot of audacity, I must admit, during my first term, I got the first and only D.C. statehood vote on the House floor. The Democrats had been in control for 40 years as I came to the Congress. I was not able to follow up on that first House vote because the Democrats lost control after 40 years. And that control has stayed lost for most of my time in the Congress. I was subcommittee chair because we were in control of the so-called D.C. subcommittee of the D.C. committee. one indication of progress is there is no more DC committee because I fought to eliminate the DC committee, which is one of many incremental steps we have taken toward equal rights for the residents of the District of Columbia. We have eliminated what was direct oversight. Imagine that, DC committee. Whole committee for the District of Columbia. That was direct oversight. Had hearings, did all the things that they do with congressional business. This was not their business. So that committee, and thus my easy-to-get subcommittee, is gone. But it was a time of great eagerness because Democrats had been controlled for so long. I mean, the Clinton administration, the president wrote in support of statehood, got on the phone and got people, went to individual members and asked them to vote for statehood. City officials and residents were fully engaged. There were some arrests. There was something called DC SWAT team that stood for Statehood Winning Team. I was so insistent on a House floor vote that I was finally able to get it just as we were about to adjourn. And in a very unusual session, we had a debate on a Saturday, and on a Sunday, we had the vote. After the vote, there was adjournment of the Congress. What was the Republican opposition, the expected Republican opposition, all about? Well, nothing particularly new. You know, it's the same as you will hear today, you know, the Constitution, you name it. But some of it was particularly lame. There was one objection saying we couldn't give statehood to the District of Columbia because in the enclave that would be left, which would be the federal city, there would be federal agencies. So there was an easy answer to that one. The CIA and the Pentagon are in Virginia, and the Social Security and NIH are in Maryland. So they're federal agencies that are not in the District of Columbia. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they have to be. The strongest argument against the District of Columbia was its very large deficit at the time, $194 million. Today, we don't have that, and I'll indicate just how far we have come while telling you how we have done it. Because I was the sponsor of the Revitalization Act, a bill I had to introduce because if you will remember, the district became insolvent. And part of the reason is that it was the only local jurisdiction carrying state functions. So, if the district becomes a state, it is going to have to pay for those state functions once again. If it becomes Washington, D.C., called now Washington Douglas Commonwealth, they will have to reclaim those costs. So, could it do so? Well, let's look at what D.C. looks like today, but bear in mind, the figures I'm going to give you are figures in part because we don't pay for some state functions like prisons, for example. Our residents go to the Bureau of Prisons. We don't pay for that. But here's what we look like today, and I think it's a picture that shows increasingly that the district can pay for what it needs to pay for. The math has never been done on that, but here's how we look today. $194 million deficit then, 1.75 billion surplus today. We've got a budget of 12.5 billion. That's larger than the budget of 12 states of the United States. Our per capita income among residents is higher than the per capita income anywhere of any state. The total personal income is higher than that of 7 states. So I am optimistic about the ability of the District of Columbia to financially handle what it takes to be a state. Other issues that would remain on the table, the commuter tax. A lot of Democrats voted for the statehood bill, but for Maryland and Virginia, who fear a commuter taxes aren't much used today, but fear a commuter tax, which any state can impose, did not vote for the bill. But interesting, Senator Mikulski was sponsor of the bill in the Senate. When we did that first vote, no win was expected, but my judgment was that we had to move forward to show this could be done. We did much better than we expected. We got 152 Democrats and even one Republican, Wayne Gilchrist of Maryland. Speaker Foley cast a rare vote. The Speaker usually does not vote. We thought we could get 120. We got 50% more than that, 150. There was tremendous elation, huge applause in the gallery, hugging on the House floor. Essentially, 60% of the House Democrats voted for the bill. Well, what about the rest of them? We had the House, my friends, because we had Southern Democrats. They were very good Democrats. They would not always vote with Democrats on the most progressive measures. But because we had so many Democrats during that 40-year period, they could vote conservatively. And so while we value them, when it came to something like statehood, they did not vote with us. They were among the 40% of Democrats, and most of those who voted against us were the Southern Democrats that, frankly, we need again if we are to really be a majority party. And I think some of them would vote differently than they did then. I mean, witness what's happening in Georgia, for example, with a black woman running for governor, or in Florida with a black man running for governor. So that was then. I'm just trying to give you some context. Even had a Senate hearing. The bill is sponsored in the Senate by Senator Kennedy. It wasn't jurisdiction. It wasn't jurisdictional, as it's called, but it was a hearing. By the way, we've also had a Senate hearing here in this latest go-round of statehood. Today's panel is well suited to lead today's discussion. They come at statehood, and this is what we were after, from very different perches. There will be a member of Congress here who is published on the subject. There is the leader of the statehood effort in D.C., who has gotten more co-sponsors than any of our many very good organizations working on D.C. statehood. And there is an AU student who is an ANC commissioner, and you will hear how she comes at statehood, as AU students have been involved, their own organization, for statehood. So, Bo, let me begin with you. You don't have to come here. You can speak from there. Bo has been indispensable to our effort to show strength by getting co-sponsors. That was our goal each year, get more co-sponsors than the last time. He is executive director of DC Vote, and he's had a post there before that may have prepared him to get all the co-sponsors that he has done. He was director of advocacy at DC Vote. He's got deep experience in politics. He was on the Gore election team in Florida. You know what that meant? Florida, where we almost...
Not my fault.
Well, you say they had to put their very best on that election team because we should have had that voted, and the proof of the pudding is it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. He has been on the staff of the HRC. He has been in the campaign of Mayor Bowser, and he joined DC Vote in 2016 with gave the organization renewed energy for statehood. So I'm going to ask Bo to begin our discussion this afternoon.
Thank you for that introduction. Humbling to be introduced by your own congressperson in that manner. I do want to disagree with one point. I am absolutely not calling myself, nor would I won't accept the mantle of the leader of the statehood movement in D.C. I am but one piece in a really vital and vibrant coalition of organizations and individuals who have worked far longer than I have and with far deeper connection to the statehood fight. So I'm happy to be part of it, but I'm going to take that mantle off and put it on others, mostly because I don't want the pressure. Kidding. I was asked to put together sort of an introduction on my passion about statehood and about what brought me to this fight and what brought me to this effort before we get into the conversation about what does the future look like. And I come at this issue, I had the privilege and honor of serving as Mayor Bowser's campaign manager in the 2014 election cycle. And it exposed me to a district that I thought I knew, but I had absolutely no comprehension of, actually, it turns out. I went to school at GW. I was born in Fairfax and lived in the area when I was young, and then I came back and went to GW, and then I came back to work for the Human Rights, came back, and I came back to work for a different this, and I came back, and I came back, and I came back, and I kept coming back to D.C., and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the city. I was 150% wrong about my understanding of the city as it related to when I started that campaign in 2014. My understanding of the city was really limited by a triangle bounded by the Potomac River, the Anacostia River, and U Street, with the exception of a little antenna that every once in a while we stretched up and went to the zoo. That's what I knew of DC, and I still loved it. But working on the 2014 campaign exposed me to all of the other parts of the city, and whatever love existed for the district before has manifested itself in all new levels and all new appreciations for the neighborhoods and the people that live here. And that's the passion that I bring to this city, to this fight, is the energy and the people that live here in the district, and my desire to do what I can to be helpful in achieving equality for all of those people. I come out of the LGBT marriage fight. I come out of literally the biggest disenfranchisement of voters in history in the 2000 Gore election. I am used to, and I have put myself into fights that are about representation and equality. And this is the next fight in that frame. I posted today on Facebook, I interacted with somebody yesterday who works for one of the major labor unions, and they called Doug Jones from Alabama a progressive senator. And I flippantly commented on his Facebook, oh, did he sign on to statehood? I must have missed that. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you want to wear the mantle of progressive, you have to be on the statehood bill. Otherwise, you're just a Democrat. And I want to imagine a longer rant today about the fact that if you are concerned about any issue that are a core pillar of the Democratic Party or of progressive politics, and you are not concerned about statehood, you are weakening your own pillars. If you are concerned about choice, but are not full-throated involved in the statehood piece of that, you are leaving the women and those who care about choice issues in the district behind. Specifically, communities of color and women of color being left behind if you are not involving statehood in your fight on choice. If you are concerned about guns and weapons and are not involved in the statehood piece of that, you are tying the hands of leadership who would like to work on violence and gun violence specifically, especially in communities of color here in the district. Every single issue that matters to Democrats, to the members of the CBC, to the folks who are in this conference, are impacted directly by the fight for statehood. And it is yet another example in our system of white supremacy and racism at play as we make law. And so to not engage in this fight, now that I know about it, would be irresponsible as an individual. And it also feels to me like the right place to be because I care about all those other issues. That's what brings me the passion to care about this issue, because you cannot build pillars of equality on a broken system. You simply can't. And we have a broken system. We have 700,000 people in this district who are unrepresented. We're ably represented in the House of Representatives. We're unrepresented completely in the Senate, and we have no vote in the House of Representatives. And that has to be fixed before we can begin to address the issues that move us forward. I'm of the opinion, and I absolutely want to get into a conversation, so I'm going to cut this off. I'm of the opinion that a House vote next year, should the Democrats have control of the Congress, makes complete sense. I think that we should be pushing for it constantly. I am of the opinion that we should be pushing statehood everywhere all the time. And that if you are having big yesterday I went to a panel put on by End Citizens United, the folks wanting to remove money in politics. And I stood up and asked Steny Hoyer a question about statehood as it relates, because they had this huge sign that said, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I'm like, do you have a gigantic asterisk that eliminates the 700,000 people of D.C.? Because it's not of these people. And we challenged Steny Hoyer yesterday. I'm going to a reception for a woman who's running for the House in Iowa tonight, and I'm going to challenge him again because I didn't like his answer yesterday. That's what I think we all need to be doing, and I think that the House vote is an extension of that. It's a way to challenge the Democrats in the House to actually stand up for statehood and finally be the allies that the platform claims they are, and that they love to give us lip service in when they're raising money in D.C.
Well, thank you very much, Bo. When you speak about Democrats standing up, I just want to take a page from your book by your work in continually bringing D.C. statehood, to members. You have helped us focus members on it. I don't think our problem, at least among Democrats, is that they're not active enough. They're not supposed to be active. They're supposed to vote and to do whatever else we tell them. And one of the things we want to do here is to indicate, what do we want Democrats to do besides what they are doing? In part because of your effort, they are indeed doing what people usually do when they want something. They are, in fact, almost all of them, on the bill. Okay, what's next? And that's going to be up to us. And I do thank you for correcting me if I called you the leader. I thought I had said a leader.
Maybe.
If I did, and I could have, because I'm so impressed with what you've done in getting so many co-sponsors. The reason a leader is the way to describe Bo is that we must have a dozen organizations working for D.C. statehood as I speak. One of the reasons for seeking a vote is to, or perhaps not, and I think we ought to beware of the pros and the cons, is to help people climb to the next step. And particularly now that we have most of the Democrats on the bill. So we've got to consider this from a strategic point of view, not just a feel-good point of view, which I guess is where we are now because we have so many Democrats on the bill. So I thank you both for those comments that start us off. Now we've got a very different speaker, and I'm so pleased to have her here. I must tell you, I was delighted to learn that American university students, most of whom do not come from the District of Columbia, had their own statehood organization. That was quite amazing to me because they invited me to speak, among others, on statehood. And I walked in the room. I wish I had brought it with me. And there was something that we had never thought of: D.C. statehood cups that they were continuing to pass out. So we're talking about very active students who know where they live, at least during the school year. Now, Taylor Berlin is very interesting because she is not only a an AU student, she is an ANC, Advisory Neighborhood, commissioner for, and she'll have to tell us if it's for AU or for that area and how she operates as a ANC commissioner. She's a junior at American University, and she prides herself on being D.C.'s youngest elected official. She thinks she is. The rest don't own up to their age at all, beginning with me. She's studying international affairs, but she also has a minor in public administration. She became interested in D.C. and its status when she came to understand through her work on politics here what our actual issue was. And she began to be involved in the statehood movement at her university. And she wants to include more young people in the process, which is a very worthy goal. She has become a leader of the statehood movement as well. I'm very pleased to ask Taylor Berlin to speak to us now.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I just wanted to say how pleased I was that you were able to come to campus last semester as well. And you should see all we have now. We've got pizza cutters and magnets and a lot more than just cups. So I'll have to bring you some of that stuff too.
How do I get
The pizza cutter?
Yeah.
I'll hook you up.
sounds perfect.
So my relationship with the DC statehood fight is very different than Beau's. Obviously, I haven't spent as much time in the district. I just came here as a student 2 years ago, although I do already feel like it's my home and I don't want to live anywhere else. But I became involved with the fight because of the ANC. AU is the #1 most politically active university in the United States, according to the Princeton Review for 2018, which we're very proud of because we kicked GW out of #1. Sorry about that.
That's because I left.
But what surprised me was that this ANC seat, and I do represent AU's campus, so 3,000 young people who all could be part of the fight for DC statehood. And the seat had been vacant for 3 years, over a full term of the ANC. And I couldn't understand why a school full of people just like me were all interested in being politically active, to the point where we were, the #1 in the country, didn't want to hold this position. And what I came to realize was that nobody wanted to be a part of DC government because they didn't feel that it was worth their time, because they didn't see DC government as being powerful enough, since DC isn't a state. And so I knew I wanted to do it immediately and saw the potential for DC, but it actually took a lot of convincing just to get signatures for my petition to fill the vacancy. I actually had to register 20 of the 25 signatures I needed because there were all of these people who said, yeah, I'd love to support you, but why would I want to register in DC to vote? This isn't the place where I want representation. And so since I've taken over the seat, a lot of what I've been doing has been trying to increase voter enfranchisement, and specifically youth voter enfranchisement, because I do think that's the next big place where you're going to see the fight for DC statehood come from. And I think AU is a pretty good example of that.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Could I just ask you first, where are you from?
So I'm originally from Connecticut, and my parents live in Northern Virginia now. So DC is pretty much my full-time home.
One of the things we've got to do is to not only, I didn't even know about the pizza cutters, but we want to be able to distribute these, to find out how do you buy them. I indicated there were at least a dozen organizations for DC statehood, and I'm very sorry that DC statehood cup I didn't bring, which sits on my desk. What you see is young people thinking of new ways to make people know about statehood, to get them more interested in statehood, to let them know you can be with it, with statehood, because that's the kind of thing that's pizza cutters, I don't know where the DC statehood part is, and cups do. So we'll have to learn more about distribution, how do we buy them, and the like. Now, if we need a microphone for people to participate, we need feedback from you. You've heard from two of our speakers. I'm sure Jamie is trying his best to get here, but if he had a bill that he had to speak about, I can understand. He did call us and tell us that he would be here because he anticipated he'd be held up in committee.
And this
Ah.
is one of the mugs we give out as well. So
Thank you. There you see it. It says Students for DC Statehood. Now, you know, everybody in DC ought to have that cup. So, could I invite your comments or your questions? Could I begin by asking Bo, what was most instrumental for you and the members you got to sign on to DC statehood? Was it apparent? Was it going there? Was it constant mailing them? Obviously, you were getting people on the bill who hadn't paid a lot of attention, or they'd have been on the bill anyway. I'd be most interested in hearing your experience.
Yeah, I think that there were two events that were really sort of fundamental to large waves of co-sponsors coming on board. We saw them in clumps. And the first one was a leadership lobby day, for lack of a better phrase. We did outreach to a series of organizations, Democracy for America, Compassion and Choices, the Human Rights Campaign, Planned Parenthood was asked and sent somebody for a while. There was an environmental group. But anyway, you get the idea of a coalition of organizations that were, and the Statehood Coalition as well. But it was beyond the Statehood Coalition. These were organizations who have non-statehood issues in front of them that they deal with and that their memberships deal with. But more importantly, they have large numbers of constituents within their membership base. DFA has hundreds of thousands. HRC has close to 500,000. And we brought the leadership of those organizations with us to talk to members of the House about statehood. So the conversation that I was having earlier, that if you care about these issues and aren't engaging on statehood, you're missing part of the conversation, we leveraged that into a series of meetings over the course of the day. That led to a good wave of co-sponsors, and it also led to a good wave of intel. We knew which of the people we met with needed more contact from constituents, which people we met with needed more contact from different organizations, which organizations were going to be useful, and we followed up with a second lobby day of DC residents and friends and family, folks who wanted to participate. We had over 100 folks register. We held 40 some odd meetings over the course of the day. And then we let loose Barbara Helmick, who is with us, as our follow-up attack person. And relentless emails and phone calls following up on those meetings, to where if they promised us they were going to get on a bill and they didn't get on the bill within a certain number of time, Barbara was relentless in her emails and phone calls following up with those staffs, as were our volunteers. We reached out to our team leaders to have them make follow-up phone calls for the meetings they had. We reached out to some of just the regular volunteers that had come with to do that follow-up as well. But I think it was a two-pronged strategy of really engaging those organizations that have significant memberships, so that these folks know HRC and DFA, et cetera, are paying attention to statehood, but then really direct contact with House members and getting them to follow up. And we got some surprising ones, and we're going to keep going after the 35.
This is really interesting to hear, because it tells us that people for statehood. So you might ask me, a member of Congress, so why did they have to work so hard? They worked. You can see they had to work it. I can tell you why. Members, as I speak, are focusing on what's happening on the House floor. And you get the daily beast on what's coming up, and you're focused on preparing that member for that vote, because that's on some issue, and she's not on that committee. So people really are focused on the immediate matter. And that's why hearing what it takes is, I had no idea, is so important, and why we have to be so appreciative. Now I understand there's a, yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Nicole Cedar-Rahman, and I live in Ward 4 of the district. Just a question about outside game, kind of what is the strategy to build broader national public awareness about this issue? Kind of how are you using press, the media, social media, to just build more of a groundswell around the issue? I think a lot of people kind of intellectually kind of agree with the concept, but there's, I'm finding, not enough passion behind pushing the agenda forward.
This is really a very important question. And the reason it's important is if you've been trying to get statehood for 200 years, it's not exactly kind of the issue that gets people all excited. So your answers to Danielle Taylor probably should begin, because she's got to work with people who are not from D.C., who obviously don't even know about statehood, and yet you've been able, you at AU, to actually start a whole organization for D.C. statehood. So perhaps we should begin with you.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges, like the Congressman said, is that a lot of students coming into DC universities aren't from the district or from the DMV area and don't even realize a lot of the problems with DC not being a state. They don't understand that our annual budget has to be approved by Congress, or that before 1973, we didn't vote on city council members. So very important things that I think are just lost to people who don't live here and don't experience that every day. And so some of the big things that AU Students for DC Statehood and the other collegiate organizations that other DC colleges have done are letter writing campaigns to people back home to try and raise awareness to family members who aren't in the district right now. Very good social media effort, which is not surprising for a bunch of communication majors. We do a lot of events on campus where we have great speakers like the Congresswoman come and talk about how important statehood is. And I find that a lot of young people in DC right now, whether or not they plan on being permanent residents, once they learn about the issue and they understand the importance of statehood, they become impassioned, but it's really about reaching out to them and making sure that they recognize that this is an issue.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to recognize is that if my count is correct, and I'm sure folks will correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there are fewer than 10 individuals that work full-time on statehood for the district across all of the organizations, including the district government. If you total it all up, I believe we are less than 10 total, including my organization. DC Vote has 4. And so the ideas outweigh the resources. And we have gazillion ideas on how to increase the passion and increase the reach. What we are doing is sort of threefold. Inside the district, we have created a program called District 435, where we match an individual who lives in the district with their counterpart, their family member, their business associate, their friend that lives in a district outside of DC, a congressional district. So I use my mom as the example all the time. I live here. My mom lives in the 3rd District in Minnesota, swing Republican district. Hopefully we're going to get it in the blue wave. If you eat Talenti ice cream, the guy who founded it is the one running. Good ice cream, better congressman. When we need to do something in Minnesota about statehood, my mom doesn't know a ton about statehood, except that I've now educated her. She's not super active on the issue because it's not something that empowers her every day. But when I call her and say, Mom, here's an op-ed, will you sign it and send it to the Star Tribune? She'll do it, right? So now we have local individuals within that district communicating with their elected officials. We're trying to find one person to match with all 435 districts, D435. That's how we're working within the city. Outside of the district, we are doing grassroots campaigns in other locations. We have canvassers on the ground in 4 states right now: Michigan, Indiana, Arizona, and Nevada. We have volunteer organizers that we used. We worked with the Netroots Foundation at the Netroots Nation Conference to bring 4 young people in, train them on Netroots and digital outreach and social media. And now they're back in their districts or in their cities in Seattle, St. Cloud, Minnesota, Atlanta, Georgia, and Houston, Texas, right? Yeah, Houston, Texas. And we're going to do actions with them. We're planning 2 town halls in conjunction with League of Women Voters right now in Atlanta and St. Cloud, Minnesota. So we're leveraging the small dollars that we've got and the small staff that we have to try and make that impact greater. We're not in Kansas, for example, because in Kansas, we're not going to win yet. So we've looked at states where we think we can move elected officials and move passion. We're in communities of color. That's why we're in Arizona and Arizona and Nevada to reach Latino voters. We're in Indiana, we're in Gary, Indiana specifically, and Detroit, Michigan specifically, to reach communities of color in those 2 communities because we think they're going to be more receptive of the message. So it's about using our resources in really strategic, tiny ways. We have online tools. We have close to 4,000 people who have signed the statehood petition from all over the country. We have...
What's the statehood petition?
I stand for statehood. Very clear, but it means that we have names, addresses, emails, and phone numbers of people who live in congressional districts all across the country. So I think there's a ton of work still to be done. The way that we're looking at it is similar to the way that I worked on the marriage fight for LGBT community, and we've patterned a lot of this after that, in that we knew we wouldn't win by operating. We tried to win by operating in the center, by passing civil unions and relationship recognition and domestic partner registries and things that looked like marriage but weren't actually marriage, because we thought we could capture centrist Republicans and Democrats, and we did for a little bit, and then they smacked us with ballot initiatives. So we retooled a little bit and said, no, we need to really make this a core value of who we are and move it from the left to the right, from the progressive sphere through the centrist, and then pick up some Democrats. And so I love to use Ohio as an example. I work there, but we started with the Dennis Kuciniches of the world, the super progressive, super liberal members of Congress. They were already on board, and we have that on statehood. This Congressional Progressive Caucus is now 100% on statehood. And then eventually we moved through the center, and eventually Rob Portman, senator from Ohio, who is certainly not progressive, said he was in favor of LGBT marriage. So that's the model that we're following, and that's how we target our work across the states.
You know, that's encouraging, because it means that having started with getting the only co-sponsors we can, Democrats, matters. And then you are equipped to move wherever you have to move. And obviously you have to get Republicans at some point. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Asa Gordon. I'm Secretary General of an organization called the Sons and Daughters of the United States Colored Troops. That's associated with the African American Civil War Museum here in Washington, D.C., and you have an opportunity here. I'd like to go down to Tiffany and you and visit it while you're here. I also serve as chair of the D.C. Statehood Green Party Electoral College Task Force. And one of the things, D.C. is uniquely positioned to be the conscience of America. Like one time, the Black Caucus is the conscience of the Congress. And the black press used to be the conscious of the media. And let me propose a solution that would, we should home here. Taxpayer Voter ID Act. That is universal and automatic registration for all citizens of a state that files a federal income tax. If the documentation is good enough to take my money, it's good enough to take my vote. If the documentation that you accept from me to pay my taxes isn't, then give me back my money. All right, no photo ID, here's the catchphrase, no photo ID required to pay my taxes, no photo ID required to take my vote. And so the Federal Register, all the information that you put in for your federal registration is already, you file that when you file your federal income tax. So that information is passed over to the Department of Registration for that state, and they are required to mail to a citizen taxpayer their voter registration and voter ID. Automatic universal registration for all citizen taxpayers. Now the question comes up, what about those non-citizens who pay taxes? They file what is called a 1040 NR, non-resident. If you file a 1040A or 1040EZ, you check a box that says, I am a citizen under penalty of perjury. If that is sufficient to take my money as a taxpayer, that should be sufficient to provide me with a vote. And so I'm proposing that I have legislation kind of drafted around there. I've tried to set up a meeting with you.
Well, I'd be glad
Okay.
to sit down with you. I'm not sure how, this is a very creative, interesting idea. I'm not sure how it gets us towards statehood for the District of Columbia.
Well, here's how it gets us to state first. First, start acting like a state. All right, start doing things that set you, that the first thing you're going to try to do is say, well, how can you say, well, I'm a state? This is my state, so I'm going to do this. Another thing, as a state, we can act is, we can determine how we apportion our presidential electors. Why do we do it on a winner-take-all basis? First, I suppose that D.C. says we're going to do it on a proportionate basis. And then D.C. sue the rest of the states because you in violation. We are the only one who apportion our presidential elections in a fair and equitable manner based on one vote, one vote. So then D.C. is in position to sue the rest of the states who are violating that principle. Now, what principle they are violating? They're violating the second section of the 14th Amendment, which is the section of the 14th Amendment that was enforced during Reconstruction. And by the way, this is sesquicentennial commemoration of the adoption of the 14th Amendment, that reduces the state representation in proportion to its citizens' disfranchised. D.C., we can put in a bill that says that in D.C. we're going to enforce that provision of the Constitution. Now, when they come at
I've got to ask for responses from the panel, and then go on to the next person.
I just suggest that two methods that we can talk about. D.C. can determine how it apportions its presidential elections, right? The D.C. can do that. So what I'm saying is D.C. go forward and say we're going to do it on a proportional basis first. Second thing, D.C. can determine whether or not it wants to have a taxpayer voter, a high automatic registration for its citizen, that it pass the Taxpayer Voter ID Act. And then we will be acting like a state, and then they will respond to that.
Just a couple things. We already have automatic voter registration as attached to driver's licenses, all kinds of, any government. No. I'm talking about in DC. Right. We've already passed automatic voter registration, so we actually register more than your suggestion would allow for.
More people pay taxes. How many people?
Not everybody pays taxes.
No,
but I'm happy to have a conversation with you afterwards about this specific one. But automatic voter registration, it was enacted in the district, and it's one of the most progressive voter registration laws in the country. As to the proportional representation, I think we have de facto proportional representation in that since 1964, the vote for Democrat has been so unbelievably overwhelming that none of those three electoral votes would have ever changed.
No, we do not. We have winner take all. We have a statute in our code.
I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is the percentage that is voted for Democrats since 1964, when we established electoral votes for the district, has been so overwhelming that we basically have proportional because nothing would have changed. None of those electoral votes would have changed.
You don't know if a third of the district residents would not vote green if you have proportional and I get one elected. You don't know that.
It's an interesting thing, but I don't think it gets us any closer to statehood. What it does is we act like a state that's defining first do what we can do as a state. And then if we get proportional.
Well, just let me say, because I've got to go on. And we got somebody else. I got to say there are things we can do to act like a state, and much of what you've said would take a bill and passage to become law. So I think this kind of creative thinking is what we want more of in the District of Columbia.
I also find that just from a youth activism perspective, a lot of times talking about voter enfranchisement in all of its forms, whether that's automatic voting in places other than DC or lowering the voting age to 16, which I know cities in Maryland have done, talking about statehood as part of voter enfranchisement is very important, especially in trying to get youth activists involved.
Okay.
Because
My name
that's
is Phyllis
fascinating in the
Robinson
country.
Paul. I'm an ambassador with Stand Up for Democracy, and a parent and a grandparent, and very concerned about our disenfranchisement with statehood. My daughter served as a page many, many years ago as the first page for the District of Columbia. I would like to see the District of Columbia in their government class, that's the 12th grade, that more students learn about statehood. A lot of the children are leaving the high school with no idea of what statehood is. That should not be. We live here, 700 of us, and we should know. Our DC public schools should make sure that our children leave here and know something about statehood. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see our district government make sure that there is an actual class for statehood, and maybe invite our Congresswoman to come out and talk to the students, because the children know nothing about it. And my daughter, when she got down there on the House floor, she was concerned that, some of the students were saying, well, DC doesn't have a vote. We don't even know why you're down here. And she said, well, I'll stand. And she stayed. But I'm saying to you that charity begins at home. We need to start right here in the District of Columbia, making sure that all of our children know what the deal is.
Well, I wish there was somebody here from the DC Public Schools, because I think this is very good, a very good suggestion, because there is a course you're required to take to graduate from high school here about the District of Columbia. And I cannot sit here and tell you they don't say anything about statehood, but I tell you one thing I'm going to find out based on your question as to whether or not that course also informs students or allows them to engage in the study of statehood and why DC doesn't have it. I think it's a very good. We're certainly going to find out, because you raised a very good point. That's a sitting audience, a captive audience. But before we go any further, I am so grateful to Jamie Raskin, who's involved in very important House business, and is the third member of this panel that he has struggled to get here and has gotten here. He's our neighbor in Montgomery County and the surrounding area. He's vice-ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. He serves on 2 of its committee, and he also does something that I did when I came to Congress too. He was a professor is a professor at American University, where one of our speakers, of course, is from, and he's a professor of constitutional law. Now, Jamie could have written about lots of things, and he has. He's been a very prolific writer, but I should indicate that when I came to the House, and this is something that if we get the House vote, at least we'll be able to get again, Jamie came to me about the vote on the House floor in the Committee of the Whole. And as long as when the few years the Democrats have been in power, I've had a vote on the House floor in the Committee of the Whole. Problem is, a lot of business is transacted in the whole House, not the Committee of the Whole. So he was deeply involved in DC matters from the very beginning. He's also written about our plight, and he has a law review article in the Catholic University Law Review called Domination, Democracy, and the District, the Statehood Position. He has a unique perspective to bring here as an original co-sponsor of the statehood bill, and as someone who has lived through statehood and studied statehood. So I'm so pleased you could get here, Jamie. You take it from here.
Congressman Norton, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with everybody. We actually last did a town meeting together around the neo-Nazi march in D.C., and we came together, both Maryland's 8th District and the District of Columbia, and I was very proud that we had several hundred people come to that town assembly. This is of fundamental importance. It's a matter that's close to my heart. The people in the room don't need to be reminded of the brutal facts of the situation. We're the only democracy on earth where the people of the capital city are disenfranchised in their own parliament. That's an outrageous, scandalous, and untenable posture. As everybody knows, there are more people who live in the district than in 2 of the states, Vermont and Wyoming, I think it is. Certainly lots more tax monies coming in from the people of D.C. than a couple dozen states. So there's no justification going forward. But of course, the politics of statehood admissions have always been very much wrapped up with partisanship and whatever's going on in the times. We, of course, started with 13 states, but we've added 37 states since then, if I'm doing the math right. So we had 37 statehood admissions, and all of them were surrounded with complaints that the applicant state was somehow too big, too small. It was its own republic, like Texas was. It's too far away. It's not contiguous, like Hawaii, Alaska. Any manner of adjectives or complaints have been thrown at the process. But fundamentally, the basic democratic imperative has won out, which is that we don't want to be an empire. We don't want to be colonialists over people. America was founded against that idea. Everybody is not virtually represented, that is virtually represented by somebody else, but everybody's represented by the representatives of their own choice. So it's just an unjust situation, and I do think and I hope that when the Congress changes hands, it's something that we pay attention to. And the people in D.C. are not the only ones who are disenfranchised under the current regime. Arguably, it's the most egregious case because people are paying taxes and have all of the other obligations of citizenship but don't have representation. But we know that there are millions of people in the territories, in American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, who are disenfranchised even in presidential elections because they don't have anything like the 23rd Amendment, which did give people in the capital city the right to vote in presidential races. And there are millions of other disenfranchised people who've been convicted of offenses around the country but still live in states that don't give them their voting rights back at the end of their sentences. Most states do, but a bunch of states still don't. And so, the situation in D.C. is reflective of the general weakness of voting rights in the Constitution. We didn't start off with a Constitution that protected people's right to vote and be represented. And so what we have is a series of ragtag, ad hoc constitutional amendments that enforce anti-discrimination, like on race, 15th Amendment, gender, the 19th Amendment, D.C. presidential elections, 23rd, poll taxes, 24th, 18-year-olds, 26th. But nowhere do you get the universal command that everybody have a right to vote at every level of government over them, which is what we need. And if you look at constitutions around the world, you look at the new South Africa Constitution, it's the very first article that everybody has the right to vote and to be represented at every level. So there are a bunch of interesting strategic political questions, which you have your great Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton to guide you on to try to figure out the path. But I think this is something that when we take Congress back has got to be right at the top of a democracy agenda.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to our next questioner. I do want to say when Jamie said the difficulty every state has had getting to the union, please remember that no state has gotten into a union without another state of the opposite party. And that is where we were in good stead with Utah and D.C. So this is another one of the problems we face. And he mentioned Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and the rest. You should know that there is, and something's got to be done about these territories, because the notion that the United States of America would have any part of the country not treated in the same way as other parts raises fundamental questions. But when it comes to comparisons between Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, etc., there is no, the most fundamental comparison is not there. Because at least some equity has been done to them. They do not pay federal taxes. So somehow when they got into the Union, there was the understanding that if you're not going to treat them in the most fundamental way as the states, then don't ask them to pay what the states. And our great injustice is that we not only pay what the states pay, but we are number one per capita in taxes paid to support the government of the United States. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Asia Good. I was born and raised in Ward 8, and now I am an educator in DCPS. I have two questions, very short. When we do get statehood, I'm very hopeful. What support in DCPS and underprivileged students and families will look like in terms of equity and funding? And what is your advice to get elementary school students involved in supporting DC statehood?
To get equity and funding, that's the one thing I want to indicate. We do get equity and funding. We are funded on a per capita basis. We are treated as a state in virtually every way except that vote in the Senate and in the House. So when it comes to your funds for highways and for Medicare, for all of that, that's just per person. Now, your other question was about elementary school students?
And to get them involved in support for DC statehood.
We would love, DC vote, we'd love to have them involved. We did, there was a group of grassroots moms really that came together and planned the Kids Lobby Day. And we actually brought all the way from infant to 15-year-olds to the Senate offices to meet with folks. And we'd love to have younger students involved. Programs like Mikva Challenge reach out to junior high school students, I know. Elementary's a little bit hard in trying to educate on the complexities at some level, but I think that there needs to be a development of the curriculum that's going to speak to their level. I will say, I wanted to get back to the high school question, and I think this translates, is that there is a capstone. There's a 12th grade capstone as part of the social studies curriculum that examines DC statehood. So it's just a short unit within the social studies curriculum that's required at the 12th grade level. We're working with DCPS. We're going to go this year to the National Conference of Social Studies Teachers to take that capstone to help teach teachers about DC statehood from all over the country. But I would love to, I don't know the answer on how we take it to elementary level. My mom's a teacher. I'm happy to grab her to help. She just retired. She might be up for it. I also wanted to volunteer that once we get done with DC statehood, I am happy to go run the U.S. Virgin Island effort.
Well, we need you here now. We need you here now. Let me suggest something that I think elementary school students, and let me suggest that for everybody in the audience, if you belong to an organization, you can write us and ask us, can your organization come and sit on the House floor? With a member of Congress, I can take these elementary school students to sit on the House floor where members sit, and to take adults. That's a good way to start, to show what Congress is about. Because in elementary school, you're kind of showing by doing. So if you will be in touch, and there's the chief of staff there and 2 or 3 other members here, that would be one way to begin. Okay, who was next?
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the forum today. It's very important, and I'm so glad you're having it. My name is Denise Jenkins. I'm Executive Director of Stand Up for Democracy in D.C., otherwise known as Free D.C., and we've been at this for going on 21 years now. And these fights, civil and human rights fights, because this is what it is, are not easy. I think it took Hawaii 50 years to become a state. This is not an easy battle. But we really need to emphasize, I think, for people to really be interested and passionate about it, because this takes passion to stay involved over a long period of time, is it's not just about voting rights. This is about how the people in D.C. live. It's about health care, it's about education, it's about housing, it's about every aspect of your life. We need to, one thing I think about is needle exchange. Clean needle exchange is something that Delegate Norton really had to push through Congress. HIV/AIDS was rampant, was epidemic in Washington, D.C. The Congress struck down our ability to spend our own local money to pass a clean needle exchange program. Once this was passed, and it took over 10 years for it to go through Congress. This was our local funding. The HIV/AIDS rate went down, it plummeted. So what we're talking about is not just voting rights, it's about how people live in D.C. And actually it can become a life or death issue. And it's extremely important. And I do want to comment, the National Conference of Social Studies did pass support for D.C. statehood last year, and it's composed of, it's a conference that includes teachers across the country, and they passed support for statehood, and really statehood is being taught in some schools around the country, but it should start, as Joyce said, right here. People have got to become passionate in D.C. Committed.
And I have to thank you, Anise, for always being passionate and for your work, which never stops, on D.C. statehood. And thank you for that example. I do want to say something about that example, because she could not have given a better example. When this could happen today, it's happening as I speak. We have 5 so-called attachments on our appropriation bill. The only thing they have on us now is our appropriation, and one of the speakers said has to come here to get checked off because they don't really do anything about it. But they do use it to attach issues to, and the most harmful issue, and we're going to have 2, by the way, that I'm not going to be able to get off this time. One is marijuana. Because although you can have a couple of ounces of marijuana in D.C., we can't regulate it, and we can't do what others are doing, which is raising taxes for it. And the other is abortion. They have about 3 others. I'm going to be able to get those off, but the fact that those 2 remain on every year speaks to Anise's point, but much more so, because she's given us the best example. Those 10 years where we couldn't do needle exchange, and everybody in the United States, all across the states, not everybody, but many jurisdictions were doing needle exchange, was the period that D.C. became #1 in the United States on deaths and cases of HIV. We still are #1, even though the moment I was able to get that removed, as Anise said, it plummeted immediately, but everybody else had a head start on us. So much poorer cities like Baltimore had better rates, and still do than we have, because we have so much catching up to do. You couldn't have had a better example, Anise. Is there another question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Jycey Stevens. I'm a physical therapist.
Please speak into that microphone.
My name is Jycey Stevens. Sorry, that was probably too much. I'm a physical therapist at MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital here in D.C., and I moved here from Texas about 4 years ago. One thing I noticed that, or I guess a suggestion would be, and I'm sure there's a strategic plan for media and advertisement and stuff, y'all are bringing very important points and facts that I, as a DC resident, not living here my entire life, does not really think about. The federal taxes, how much we pay compared to others. Statistical facts and data seems to be very beneficial with really getting the word across and getting individuals to understand the severity. I have my friends come here and visit all the time, and we go around to these various touristy areas that everyone wants to see. And it would be so ideal if these facts were out there and broadened for the individuals who come from other areas and things like that to see what is going on and see how we're underrepresented based on these facts. And so that would be a recommendation I would have. Another thing also, because I work at MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital, I work with a lot of individuals with disabilities. I work with stroke, traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries. A lot of these individuals are individuals that want to be involved in things like this, but they may not always have the means to. And so kind of in reference to her question regarding how elementary students can be involved, how can we get the community of individuals with disabilities to be involved? Because they want to be, but they don't always have the access, whether transportation means and things of that nature, to get there. Sometimes even to vote. Like, they want to vote on these things, but they may not have access because of metro access and things of that nature. But how can we get them involved as well? And thank you for this panel. It's been very informational.
Is there any response from the panel?
I'm going to give as great an answer as I did with the elementary school kids. I don't know, and we're going to figure it out. If there are really, one of the big challenges is how do we capture the energy of folks who want to get involved and get them going in ways. I know that you guys are doing a letter writing campaign shortly.
And I can talk a little bit more about that. So in some different ways, college students face a lot of challenges when it comes to informing members and voting on these issues. Some of it is just that they aren't full-time residents, they don't vote here, things like that, where it's very hard for students to always be involved. And so we are doing a letter writing campaign. And so that gets the word out both to members of Congress and to family members and friends outside of the district. So you have that same support that you were talking about with the great District 438 program, but you're also reaching out to members of Congress in their respective districts if they are residents somewhere else. And in terms of how do we educate people as young as primary school, obviously I'm not that young, though I am young. And I found that even at the collegiate level, students still feel like they have to wait for something. They have to wait until they graduate high school. They have to wait until they graduate college, until they have a full-time job. And I think even with elementary school children, there is a way that you can talk about statehood for them to grasp. And I think people would be surprised by how much very young children can be passionate about subjects like this and how much they want to be involved.
Could I just indicate the most underused way to involve people, and it's really the the bane of my existence, and that is social media. For a long time, I have been pressing D.C. residents to do something that I cannot do because the House rules keep me from engaging in anything that looks like lobbying. We do not have a coordinated social media presence. That makes us look very much behind the time. Now, we have lots of people on social media talking about statehood and various aspects of statehood. But when I say coordinated, this is what we need to get these people who are disabled, people who are in D.C. and are not activated. We would need no more than maybe 4 or 5 people to help us each week. You wouldn't need more than a couple of, let's say you decided either maybe that week you want one, that week maybe you want 2 messages to go out indicating something about D.C.'s statehood. For example, Anise talked about needle exchange. We have needle exchange now, but as we try to get things off of our appropriation, to point up that as an example with the message of the day, that's but what we need, and I don't know, I bring this up every time I talk to D.C. residents, but it's going to take somebody to say, I am going to be the message person for social media for statehood. And I'm going to gather with me some folks who would like to be involved in this, and we're going to flood the country with messages, all of which are coordinated every week, and then you would spread the message the way it is done in the 21st century. The best example is the Me Too movement. The best example is the movement that of black men, when people got in the streets, that were people being shut down. They didn't have an organization. All they had was social media, and that is the one thing we are not doing well. Yes, sir.
I'm James Wright with the Afro-American newspaper. I have two quick questions for Congressman Raskin. My first question is could you explain to people why you don't need a constitutional amendment for D.C. to become a state? The second is that let's just lay it on the table. Outside of D.C., there's a perception that D.C. is too urban, too democratic, and too black. Could you address that as a non-D.C. resident?
Great. Well, on the first question, there's never been a state that's been admitted by way of a constitutional amendment. You simply don't need it for a statehood admission. The fact that D.C. used to be part of Maryland doesn't distinguish it from lots of states that used to be part of other states, like West Virginia, obviously, or Vermont, which used to be part of New York, or Maine, which I think used to be part of New York. Lots of states have been part of other states. So Article 4 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to admit states. In fact, there's already a precedent for Congress redrawing the federal district that's called for in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the seat of government, because Fairfax and Alexandria and Arlington used to be part of the District of Columbia, and that was redrawn by Congress and ceded back to Virginia in the retrocession in 1846. So Congress, by a similar logic, could redraw the boundaries of the seat of government to give the land to a new state, or what have you, for whatever purpose Congress wanted. As for those political statements, I think that I can't remember if that goes back to Teddy Kennedy but somebody made that speech saying, we know the real reason why D.C. is not getting its representation. It's too liberal, it's too urban, it's too black. I can't remember what the other one was, but those, of course, are not legal objections or constitutional objections. Those are just political realities, and there's obviously something to it. As Congresswoman Norton said, most states have entered the union like animals boarding Noah's Ark, in twosies, in pairs. So Hawaii and Alaska did it together. Vermont and Kentucky did it together. Everybody remembers the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So there's generally some kind of political deal that's made to have two states admitted. Now, interestingly, Puerto Rico would seem to make an excellent candidate for this, because the Republican national platform has called for the admission of Puerto Rico as a state for decades now, just as the Democratic platform has either called explicitly for statehood or for full representation and voting rights for people in D.C. So arguably you could find some kind of deal there. The problem is that this is a new Republican Party. In the old days, you could deal with Republicans on stuff like this, and now this Republican Party would probably view Puerto Rico as a political threat. At least some people would. But what I'm impressed by is, if you look at it historically, that those kinds of objections have almost always been overridden in the interest of really treating everybody equally and putting everybody on an equal footing with respect to the Constitution.
And a delegate from Puerto Rico this year is a Republican and has put in a bill for statehood. So I signed on to the bill and have asked that person to sign on to the D.C. statehood bill. I don't believe the person has as of yet. I mean, that tells you it's a lot about being Republicans. This notion about too black has certainly been the case in the last 40 years. But so that you won't think that there's some path for statehood, For example, as DC becomes whiter, please remember that for most of its existence as a city, DC was a majority white city. It was only as we came into the late 60s that DC became a majority black city and finally became profoundly black in the 70s, and now it's going the other way around. So it's going to take something more than race even to get us. Wait a minute, who has the microphone? Oh, he has the microphone. They'll bring you the microphone, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Levy Berger, and I'm a student at School Without Walls, which is a high school kind of on the GW campus. It's a DCPS magnet school. And I know our school gets very involved in a lot of these kinds of movements like DC statehood, but we haven't actually gotten very involved in DC statehood. So we have students who are involved in the ACLU, for example, and last year we even had a week where students attended 25 hours volunteer work at an ACLU summit for a week during the school year last year. But we haven't seen anything like that with DC statehood, and there isn't a lot of push for that kind of the DC statehood and voting in DC. We have students registering to vote at our school. We had that last week, but we don't have anything involving statehood. And an organization like DC Vote and things like that, are you able to do something like, say, the ACLU or other organizations, or actually not only work with high school students, but in high schools to push this kind of agenda?
Yeah, would you explain, there is, in order to graduate from high school in DC, a student must volunteer. Would you tell us what the requirement is?
So we do 100 hours of volunteer work to graduate from Walls, at least. I know that's the requirement. There's also, since I know earlier we were talking about like classes and having to understand DC statehood as a class, you have to take half a year of DC history as well. But even in those things, DC statehood is rarely addressed, and there's some level that it's addressed on, but there's no focus on it, and that's not what people are talking about.
DC Vote's engagement with high school students, we've actually worked with School Without Walls a couple of times. Most of our relationships with high school activity and activists is partnership, specifically with Mikva Challenge, Close Up Foundation, and other organizations that then work with schools. Unlike the ACLU, we don't have the capacity to absorb a large number of volunteers, and we don't have a national conference like they did. It's an amazing opportunity, and I'm glad you guys got to be involved with that.
But you could still do it, couldn't you?
Do
volunteers, to ask them to do their volunteer.
We absolutely have volunteers from School Without Walls and other high schools that are involved with DC Vote, typically through some of these partnering organizations, Mikva Challenge and others. We had 2 high school students with us, just that program just ended. So we do work with different schools. If there's an opportunity for us to come talk to the school, we'd love to. Talk with me or Barbara afterwards, and we'll get contact information. We do that kind of stuff as well all the time. But we tend to partner with organizations that manage larger numbers of high school students, volunteer opportunities, just because we don't have the capacity to absorb large numbers.
First of all, just thanks for coming and being a young person involved with this. And I would say, if you think there's an opportunity for activism at your high school and nobody else is filling it, then it might be time for you to step up. That's why I'm a commissioner. That's why I'm involved in statehood, because I looked around and said, why is nobody at AU involved in this issue? It's a big enough issue. And so I had to do it. And maybe this is the time where you stand up and do it.
Yeah. She became the youngest elected official in the District of Columbia. So maybe I'll go to Walls next time.
My name is Vernon Shannon. What are the barriers to Washington becoming a state? Or what are the arguments that others use against Washington becoming a state?
Jamie?
Well, let's see. I'm happy to try to recite the arguments, but the truth is that bigger than any arguments as an obstacle, I think, is just inertia. That people just continue to go along with it. Lots of people don't know what the problem is. A lot of people don't know that there's an active, statehood application that's been made to Congress, and the political cards are dealt in such a way today that it looks hopeless to people. So it's it's de-energizing. But But I will say that when you can engage people's attention on it, everybody thinks it's outrageous. The only arguments that could be made is, well, you shouldn't have a state because the Constitution calls for the District of Columbia or a seat of government, which is true, but the statehood measure just shrinks the federal seat of government and then cedes the land to the new state. So I think the constitutional objection is fairly easily dealt with, and then the rest is just political, which is, well, we don't want 2 more Democrats being elected. I mean, more than all of the other 2s, the real 2 is 2 Democrat. I mean, it just gets to be, in the naked arithmetic of it, just a partisan question. So I think we got to figure out some kind of deal that will be made.
I think that the president answered part of the question when he favors immigrants coming from Norway rather than
Well, there is that. There is that. No.
I think that Congressman Raskin is being very, very nice and less cynical than I am, probably. The arguments against statehood are based in racism, and the biggest obstacle is the Republican control of Congress and the White House.
Yes, I just wanted to add, it's the 4-2, so the fourth 2, TOO, is too progressive. DC is always on the cutting edge of most social issues, and there's a lot of people in Congress just don't want that, and they don't go along with it. But also, the thing about the social media, Stand Up is sponsoring a rap contest centered around youth participating in drafting or creating a rap contest around statehood, and they have to know what statehood is about, and the rap has to involve statehood. And we're hoping that it will go viral, as they call it, and go out on social media. But I think if you had 5 positions, 5 paid positions for social media, you would get your people.
Social media doesn't need paid positions. People just catch the virus and do it. I mean, if we got to pay people to get statehood, we'll never get it. You just got to look at all these things like the Me Too movement and how they didn't have anybody but somebody beginning to use social media. So we shouldn't create these obstacles for ourselves. Hashtag. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Barbara Helmick. I'm with DC Vote. I'm speaking partly just as a citizen who's worked on this since I moved to DC in 1980. I think if we have the political will and we do the grassroots organizing that we are capable of, I mean, come on, we're America, right? We've solved some really tough problems in our history. We can solve this injustice. I am not satisfied with the, we got to figure out a deal. I know how politics works. I've worked also a lot of long-range grassroots campaigns. But I think if we get into 2020 and the pundits who say good progressives could have the White House and the 2 houses of Congress, that we could figure out a way that we could get statehood through early in the game. There's a lot of people who say if DC were a Republican jurisdiction, they wouldn't be fooling around. They'd get it through. So I think we can have that political will. And I know it's going to take a lot of work on our end to make it happen, but with you 2 really brilliant, amazing, accomplished legislators, I bet we could think of something to get this through sometime after the 2020 election.
Well, that kind of determination and will is what it's going to take, but also an understanding of what it has taken in the past. For example, there is no state in the Union that didn't enter the Union with the opposite state coming in. So you have to, Now, the reason I'm not deterred by that is because the last state to enter the Union was more than 50 years ago, Alaska and Hawaii. That's a long time ago. The climate can change, but essentially what we're trying to do is to at least get D.C. I mean, if you pair us with Puerto Rico or somebody, it becomes doubly hard. But to at least get D.C. and to do it uniquely, because we don't have anybody to be paired with at this time. If this were, I don't know, even 10 years ago, I would say, well, that's not going to be easy to do. I still say it's not going to be easy to do, but as the climate changes, and it is true, by the way, that Democrats have held both houses of Congress and the presidency, and that didn't get us anywhere close to statehood, because I don't want anybody to believe that with Trump doing so badly that we might even take the Senate, that if we get a hold of it and then in 2020 get the White House, we're home free, then we still got an uphill. It's just that this hill is not quite as steep.
Can I add one thing to it?
Yeah.
So I very much appreciate the comment, because the deal, of course, is the very end of the process. The question is, how do you bring it to a place where there's the legislative power and momentum and initiative to get there? And I think you're correct that it's capitalizing on the tremendous progressive fervor, both in D.C. and around the country, that is building up now. As our niece says, the too progressive is part of it. I think that's right, but that's also the solution, because there are so many progressive movements in motion today that when you put DC situation forward as an issue, it will lift it up. And I think, Tocqueville once said that basically democracy is always either contracting, which it has been now with the Electoral College and the gerrymandering and the voter suppression and the Putin interference and the hollowing out of our institutions, or democracy's growing. And this is a way to say to the country, let's make democracy grow by bringing in the people who are left out and not even given an equal right to vote and to be represented. So I think you're absolutely right about that. It's a question of political will, as you and Eleanor say.
Was there someone else who was waiting? Because we're going to wrap up soon.
Looks like there's one more.
Thank you so much. Just a really quick question. Have you heard, is there much debate going on between, should we be pushing for full statehood versus aiming just for kind of full voting rights in the Congress? And where do folks lie on that continuum?
I can really answer that from the DC Vote perspective, in that DC Vote for a very long time was not known as a statehood organization. I think there's folks who still aren't necessarily 100% convinced that we're there, but we are. There are no piecemeal answers to this that get us to full equality except for statehood. And that's the realization that we need to bring to the forefront, and we especially need to push progressives on. This is, again, another lesson that I took from the fight for marriage, right? Civil unions sounded great, except nobody knew what the hell they were. Voting rights for a non-state entity is civil unions of statehood, right? It's some middling, made-up concept that doesn't actually answer the question, and it also, most importantly, it doesn't answer the question of congressional interference, which is the second half of this debate, right? We need to be pro-statehood, and we need to be hands-off DC all at the same time. And statehood is the only thing that solves both of those halves of this equation.
I just want you to know that, and I would have had to do the same thing, because at least I vote in committee, that Representative Raskin had to go back to vote in Judiciary Committee. That's why you saw him leave so hurriedly. What I'd like to be able to do is leave hurriedly to vote on the House floor for the residents of the District of Columbia. I want to thank everyone for coming. You have, I think, been well educated by this panel. I've learned stuff I sure don't know, and I've been in this business for a while. I hope that on Jamie's remarks, or it could have been Bo's remarks, that you got this notion that D.C. is in essence, some jurisdictions have given felons the right to vote. Many southern jurisdictions have not. Many say, once you are no longer in jail, and if you break your tie, whatever you have to do, you can vote. A lot of conservative southern jurisdictions say no. D.C. is essentially classified with those jurisdictions that are treated as felons. We're treated as felons as people who shouldn't have the vote. We ought to resent it. I began by saying that we may have the opportunity to vote on statehood on the floor, and that is a decision I've got to make. I want people to email me on what you think we should do. I indicated that I went for it once, hoping to follow up for the next step. I do want to say that if I ask for the vote, when I know we can't get it, I could conceivably get it. That would be that would be something that is not usually done, but at least was done once before we had a different speaker. It would mean that we probably wouldn't get it again until we were able to show something structural had happened. So in getting the vote, if we were to ask for the vote, essentially we'd get it as the first step to embolden people, to get people to understand what is possible. But I would not say to people, we got the vote in the House. If we were able to get 152 votes with almost no planning, and we've had all of this time, it might well be worth it. But everyone would have to be informed about how these things work and be prepared to go to the next step. I certainly want to thank our panel, which has been literally instructive as to how to do and what to do if you want to get statehood. I ask you to give them your applause, and I thank you for coming. Applause.